Solomon Dryden was never the kind of man who sought the spotlight. He didn't crave attention, nor did he want applause. But there are moments in life when a person is forced to stand tall, even when the world tries to push them down. Solomon was a former Marine, now in his 40s, with strands of gray showing at his temples and the steady eyes of someone who had seen more than his fair share of battlefields. On that day, he wore his deep blue dress uniform, polished boots gleaming, and drove 8 long hours just to make it to his son Tyrion's high school graduation. Others might have chosen a quick flight, but Solomon chose the Charger, his late wife's favorite car. Every mile on the road was more than a drive. It was a memory, a promise kept. Asterisk, I won't miss it. Asterisk. Sitting behind that wheel made him feel like she was still with him, guiding him to this moment. Yet even with medals on his chest and a uniform that spoke of sacrifice, Solomon knew what awaited him. The stares, the double takes, the quiet whispers. Being a tall black man in uniform was something he had carried for decades, and he knew the difference between curiosity and suspicion. He remembered, years ago in Okinawa, when a fellow soldier once asked him bluntly, "Do you really think someone like you is fit to lead a platoon?" He hadn't answered that question with words. He answered it by action, by pulling that very same soldier out of fire when bullets rained down. The question faded, but the sting of it never really left. The truth, though, is this. Dignity often speaks louder than arguments. Solomon believed that you don't need to shout to prove your worth. Real strength is revealed in how you live, in how you protect, and in how you honor your promises. That was the lesson he carried for his son, and the lesson he hoped Tyrion would one day carry forward. On this day, sitting in a gym filled with laughter, banners, and the smell of popcorn, Solomon wasn't just a father in a plastic chair. He was a man living out the quiet conviction that dignity and love could outlast prejudice. And yet, as the ceremony unfolded, that dignity would soon be tested. What began as a simple graduation, a moment of joy, was about to be interrupted by an order whispered through a radio. 2 guards were already making their way down the aisle, and the peace Solomon carried in his chest was about to collide with a world that still didn't want to see him belong. The gymnasium at Elmridge High was alive in a way that only small-town graduations could be. Folding chairs scraped across the floor, parents waved awkwardly at their kids, balloons bobbed against the rafters, and teachers fussed over last-minute details, as if the entire ceremony depended on the tilt of a banner or the neatness of a microphone cord. The air smelled faintly of floor wax and popcorn from the concession stand, an odd combination, but one that belonged to the rhythm of American high schools everywhere. For most families, this was a day of pure celebration. For Solomon Dryden, it was something more fragile. He sat quietly in the 3rd row, holding his ticket folded neatly in his jacket pocket. He had shown it at the door, received a nod of approval, and found his place among the other parents. But the truth is, he could feel the eyes. Not everyone. Of course, many were too busy finding their own seats or flipping through the graduation program, but here and there, glances lingered. Some were simply curious, seeing a tall man in a Marine dress uniform. Others, though, had an edge to them. The quick look, then the deliberate turn away, the whispered comment into a neighbor's ear. Solomon knew those looks. He'd felt them in waiting rooms when he sat down in a chair no one else seemed to want. He'd seen them at restaurants, when servers hesitated before approaching his table. And he'd even felt them on military bases where discipline and unity were supposed to erase such things. Those looks were as familiar to him as the uniform he wore. He reminded himself why he was here. For Tyrion. His son was somewhere in the lineup of nervous 18-year-olds, hidden among black gowns and red and white honor cords. This day was not about him, it was about watching a boy he had once carried in his arms take the first real step into manhood. He thought about how his wife would have been here, how she would have cried through the whole ceremony, fixed Tyrion's tie 3 times before leaving the house, and hugged every parent in sight. Instead, Solomon carried her memory in the form of a small, creased photograph tucked against his chest. It was both his shield and his compass, a reminder of what really mattered. The crowd rose for the national anthem, and Solomon remained as steady as a statue. His whole presence was a salute, though his hand never moved. When the last note faded, the rows of students shifted in nervous anticipation. The principal straightened her notes, and the energy in the gym settled into a humming anticipation. That was when the air changed. Down the left aisle, 2 men in black polo shirts and cargo pants began walking with a kind of purpose that didn't match the occasion. They weren't parents. They weren't teachers. They were security guards, badges glinting with the name Harlan Security Services. One was broad, shouldered with a shaved head, the other taller and leaner, chewing gum with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the room already belonged to him. Their eyes didn't wander. They were fixed on Solomon. At first, Solomon thought perhaps they were moving towards someone else. Maybe a disruption in the back, maybe an issue with a latecomer. But when they stopped beside him and leaned down, his suspicion was confirmed. "Excuse me, sir," the shorter one said, voice low but firm. "We're going to need you to come with us." Solomon turned his head slowly, calm and deliberate. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The taller guard spoke next, his tone carrying that thin veneer of politeness masking something colder. "Yeah, this section's for families of graduating seniors." Without missing a beat, Solomon slipped the folded ticket from his pocket and held it between two fingers. "This is my seat," he said evenly. "Third row, left side. Family seating confirmed." The short guard didn't even glance at the paper. "We've been told it's full." "It was full when I sat down too," Solomon replied, his voice steady but firm. "You want to tell me who gave that order?" By now, the ripple effect had begun. A woman 2 rows over nudged her husband, nodding toward the exchange. A teenager in the bleachers tilted her phone, the lens capturing the scene. Whispers passed from seat to seat. The guards shifted slightly, realizing the attention was no longer private. The taller one chewed his gum harder, his jaw working. "Look, it's not a big deal," he said. "There are extra seats in the back. Let's not make this into something it doesn't have to be." But Solomon knew the line hidden inside those words. You'd be more comfortable in the back. It wasn't about logistics. It wasn't about policy. It was the same old message, recycled through generations. You don't belong here. He locked eyes with the guard, not in anger, but in a quiet defiance carved by years of living under that shadow. "I drove 8 hours to watch my son walk across that stage," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "I'll be sitting right here." The room shifted again. Parents stopped pretending to focus on the stage. Students in the lineup craned their necks. Even the assistant principal fidgeted with her walkie-talkie, glancing nervously toward the commotion. For a moment, the graduation wasn't about diplomas or honor cords. It was about a father refusing to be erased. The shorter guard leaned closer, irritation slipping through his voice. "Sir, I'm going to ask one more time." "You can ask all day," Solomon replied, not raising his tone, not moving an inch. "I'm not moving." That was the moment when the entire gym understood something was happening, something deeper than a seating dispute. This wasn't about a chair. This was about dignity, about history repeating itself in the most ordinary of places, a school gym, on a day that should have been untouched by hate. And as the guards hovered over Solomon, the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone watching. Here's the lesson. Racism doesn't always announce itself with slurs or violence. Sometimes it shows up in whispers, in subtle orders, in the quiet attempt to push someone to the back. And the choice in that moment is the same one Solomon faced, to yield and stay silent, or to sit firm and let silence itself speak. But the story didn't end there, because in just a few moments, that silence was about to grow louder than anyone could imagine. From the far end of the gym, the doors opened. Men walked in calm, steady, deliberate. They didn't wear uniforms, but they carried something in their posture that was unmistakable. And before the guards realized what they were about to face, the balance of the room had already shifted. The joy of graduation had been threatened, but the seeds of resistance were now planted. What began as a small confrontation was about to swell into a lesson for the entire community. That dignity, once tested, does not retreat, it stands. The 2 guards hovered like shadows that refused to leave. They weren't loud, but their stance said enough. "We have authority, you don't." For them, Solomon was just another man who didn't belong in the front row, a black man whose presence unsettled the picture of celebration they thought they controlled. The taller one shifted his weight, gum still snapping between his teeth, while the shorter one adjusted the radio on his belt, glancing sideways at the bleachers as though daring anyone to challenge him. Solomon remained still, his hands resting on his thighs, his gaze fixed on the stage. He had learned long ago that stillness could be more commanding than motion. It was a discipline drilled into him on dusty roads overseas. When chaos erupts, the one who remains calm commands the field. But here, in a gym full of parents and students, the lesson took on a sharper edge. He wasn't dodging bullets, he was dodging humiliation. "Sir," the shorter guard said, this time raising his voice loud enough for those around to hear. "If you don't cooperate, you're going to cause a scene." The irony wasn't lost on Solomon. "I'm not the one making the scene," he thought. Out loud, his tone was low and firm. "You don't need to repeat yourself. My ticket is valid. My seat is valid. That's the end of it." A ripple spread through the crowd. A mother leaned to her daughter and whispered, "Why are they bothering him?" He showed his ticket. A father, 3 rows back, muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Phones were lifting now, subtle but noticeable one, then another. The moment was being recorded. The taller guard bent closer. His words meant only for Solomon. "Look, man, you'd be more comfortable in the back." There it was, the truth laid bare. Not about policy, not about logistics, about comfort, about where they thought a man like him deserved to sit. Solomon turned his head, eyes locking onto the guard's face. "I'll be comfortable right here," he said. The air tightened, the kind of tension that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. Somewhere in the student lineup, Tyrion spotted the 2 men hovering over his father. He couldn't hear the words, but he recognized the body language. He'd seen that quiet steel in his father's face before, when he was 12 and came home crying after a boy at school told him he didn't belong. His father hadn't shouted then either. He'd simply looked at him with that same expression, a reminder that dignity was not negotiable. The guards didn't care about dignity, they cared about control. The shorter one tapped his radio and muttered into it, eyes never leaving Solomon. The taller one straightened up, puffing his chest, as if sheer posture could erase the fact that he was out of his depth. "This is your last warning," he said louder this time, inviting the whole gym to hear. "To do what exactly?" Solomon asked. "To stop making trouble," the guard shot back. That was when a soft but steady voice rose from 2 rows over. An older white woman leaned forward, her voice cutting just enough to be heard. "Don't you let them move you," she said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Heads turned, murmurs grew louder. It wasn't just Solomon's fight anymore, the crowd was being pulled into the current. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one could deny what was happening. Racism had walked into a celebration disguised as authority, and now it stood exposed in front of hundreds. The guards, sensing the tide turning, grew more desperate. The taller one leaned in again. "You think that uniform makes you better than everybody else? This is a high school, not your base." And there it was, the mask slipping off completely. The insult cut not only at Solomon's race, but at his service, his sacrifice, his very identity. The hush that followed was sharper than any shout. A little girl in the front row stopped fidgeting. A father froze mid-photo. Even the chewing gum stilled in the guard's mouth. Solomon didn't flinch. He took a slow breath, not to calm himself, but to anchor the silence. Then he spoke, his voice measured, quiet, but carrying across the rows. "You need to walk away." The shorter guard bristled. His hand hovered near his belt, not on a weapon, but close enough to look like a threat. And that was the breaking point. From across the gym, a chair scraped. A man stood. He didn't say a word at first, didn't posture or wave. He simply folded his arms and stared. His coat was plain, his beard streaked with gray, but his eyes were sharp and unyielding. His name was Creed Marston, and he was no stranger to Solomon. 15 years earlier, on a battlefield half a world away, Solomon had dragged him bleeding through sand and gunfire. Today, Creed's silence spoke volumes. "You're not alone." The guards looked up, startled. Another man stood on the opposite side of the gym, then another, from the bleachers. Their movements were subtle, almost casual, but unmistakable. Postures straight, eyes steady. They weren't parents, they weren't teachers. They were soldiers, brothers bound by blood and battle, men who had once sworn that if Solomon ever needed them, they would appear, and they had. The crowd sensed it. Phones tilted higher, catching every angle. Students in line leaned out to see. Even the principal, fiddling nervously with her notes, froze mid-step. The ceremony had become secondary. What mattered now was the silent confrontation unfolding in the 3rd row. Here's the lesson. Prejudice often hides behind uniforms, behind authority, behind polite excuses. But when it's forced into the open, it loses its cover. What gives prejudice power isn't the loudness of its words, it's the silence of those who let it pass unchecked. Yet on this day, silence wasn't going to favor the oppressors. Silence was about to become the weapon of resistance. Creed finally broke the quiet, his voice calm but carrying across the aisle. Is there a reason this man is being bothered? The guards stiffened. The shorter one snapped, "We've got this under control." "No," Creed said, sharper now. "You don't." That single exchange shifted the entire room. More parents turned their heads. A teacher dropped her program. Even the students, restless minutes earlier, now stood straighter, sensing history in the making. And Solomon, sitting steady in his chair, knew exactly what was happening. The battle lines were drawn not on foreign soil this time, but in a high school gym. And just like before, he would not stand alone. The gym was supposed to echo with the rhythm of applause, the shuffle of gowns, and the nervous laughter of teenagers waiting for their names to be called. Instead, it had fallen into a silence so thick it felt like the air itself had weight. The two guards loomed over Solomon Dryden, their radios buzzing faintly, their expressions stiff. But what neither of them understood, what the crowd was just beginning to realize, was that Solomon was not sitting alone. It began with Creed Marston, the man with the salt and pepper beard and the steady eyes. He stood in the aisle with the kind of calm that only came from surviving worse storms than this. He didn't shout. He didn't flail. He just stood there, a living line in the sand. And when his voice cut through the tension, "Is there a reason this man is being bothered?" the guards faltered. But Creed wasn't the only one. Across the bleachers, a second man shifted his weight and rose from his seat. He was tall, broad, his frame carrying the memory of years of combat training. He folded his arms across his chest and locked his gaze on the guards as if to say, "You've already lost, and you don't even know it yet." A third stood near the opposite aisle, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the room with the awareness of a man who had once walked point through hostile territory. His movements were precise, efficient, like every choice mattered. Then a fourth, and a fifth, and finally, a sixth. One by one, they revealed themselves. They weren't in uniform, but they didn't need to be. Their silence was louder than any battle cry. They didn't cluster together, didn't march in formation. They spread out through the gym like pieces on a chessboard, each occupying a different vantage point, each anchoring Solomon in a web of loyalty invisible until now. The crowd began to murmur, the whispers spreading like brushfire. "Who are they? Do you see the way they move? Are they military?" Parents pulled out their phones to record, students craned their necks, and teachers shifted nervously on the stage. Even the principal, who had been rehearsing her polite congratulations, now froze, caught between fear and awe. The guards, however, didn't understand what they were facing. To them, these were just 6 men in civilian clothes, standing a little too still, looking a little too sharp. The taller guard, Malley, puffed out his chest and muttered, "We've got this handled." The shorter one, Garvin, touched his radio again, trying to mask his unease. But their bravado was starting to fray at the edges. Creed took a single step closer. His voice didn't rise, but its weight filled the gym. "You don't put your hands on him, you don't tell him to move, and you don't ask again." The words landed heavy, not just with the guards, but with everyone in the room. For years, Solomon had carried himself with quiet dignity, refusing to let the world push him into shouting for the respect he had already earned. Now, 6 men were proving that his silence had never been weakness. It had always been strength. Strength that inspired loyalty. Strength that built bonds unbreakable even after war. The gym felt alive in a different way now. A student in the lineup whispered, "That's his dad. Look, those men are here for him." Tyron, standing 3 rows back, felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He had heard bits of his father's stories, glimpses of Kandahar and missions whispered about but never fully explained. But he had never seen it, never seen the invisible brotherhood that wrapped around his father like armor, until now. This was no longer just about one seat in a high school gym. This was about a lifetime of lines drawn in sand, of dignity tested and defended. Garvin, the shorter guard, didn't like losing ground. He leaned down again, trying to reassert control. "Listen, man," he hissed. "You're making this into a situation." Solomon finally turned his head, eyes steady, voice even. "Number you are." The words hung there, undeniable. And that's when the 6th man moved. He had been sitting quietly near the back, unnoticed until now. Slowly, he rose, crossed his arms, and locked his gaze on the guards. His silence was like a gavel hitting wood. Final, absolute. Phones buzzed. The live streams ticked upward. Comments poured in. Why are they harassing him? Stand with the Marine. This is racism in real time. What began as a whisper was becoming a digital roar. Here's the lesson. Loyalty is not built in moments of ease. It's built in the fire of hardship, in the places where trust is tested and lives depend on the man next to you. That day in the gym, Solomon's quiet resolve summoned a loyalty that no guard, no order, no prejudice could dismantle. 6 men stood because one man had lived a life worthy of standing for. And yet, even as the crowd shifted toward his side, the guards weren't finished. Ego is a dangerous thing, and pride refuses to retreat gracefully. Garvin's face darkened, his jaw tightening as though each second of silence was an insult he couldn't bear. His hand twitched near his belt again, and whispers grew louder. Is he reaching for something? Is this about to get worse? Creed took another step, his voice a knife slicing through the tension. Don't mistake silence for weakness. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. The guards, the crowd, the students all suspended in that fragile balance. And everyone knew the next move would change everything. The gym blurred. The banners, the folding chairs, even the guards standing inches from his knees, all of it slipped to the edges of Solomon's mind. He had trained himself for this, the way memory sometimes intruded not as nostalgia but as a command, pulling him back into the places that had carved him into who he was. His eyes stayed on the stage, but the year was no longer 2024, and the air no longer smelled of waxed floors and popcorn. It was 15 years earlier, in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, and the air burned with dust, diesel, and gunpowder. The day had begun like too many others, scorching heat, endless dunes, and the hollow silence of waiting for an ambush that everyone knew would come. Solomon had been a gunnery sergeant then, his face leaner, his stride quicker, but the calm in his eyes already the same. His unit had been running patrols, a convoy rattling across roads so unreliable they could turn lethal with a single misstep. 6 Navy SEALs had been attached to the mission for a high-value target extraction. Creed Marston was among them, still fresh-faced then, his beard not yet streaked with gray. Beside him were Meeks, Soto, Lim, Horton, and Divas, names Solomon carried in his chest like medals no one else could see. The explosion came without warning. An IED buried beneath loose gravel lifted the lead Humvee into the air like a child's toy, flipping it onto its side in a fireball that turned the sand into glass. Dirt and steel rained down. Solomon was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing. Before he could even shout orders, the gunfire started sharp, deliberate. Not the erratic bursts of amateurs, but the coordinated rhythm of fighters who knew exactly what they were doing. "Contact left!" someone screamed. Bullets chewed into the convoy, glass and metal flying. The 6 SEALs scrambled for cover, but 2 were pinned behind the wreckage, and one Divas was trapped under a piece of the engine block, his leg pinned so badly he could barely breathe through the pain. Creed, barely 3 months in country, already had blood running down his thigh from a grazing shot. Still, he was dragging Soto by the vest, his own face twisted in pain but determined not to leave him. This was the chaos most people never see, the kind of moment when training collides with fear, when survival depends on who you are at your core. And Solomon, calm in the storm, did what he had always done. He moved. He sprinted across open ground, bullets snapping at the dirt around him. He slid behind the wreckage, shouting orders, his voice cutting through the smoke. "Stay low. Suppression fire on the ridge. Creed, get him moving." Creed nodded, gritting his teeth as he heaved Soto toward cover. Then Solomon saw Divas. The young SEAL's leg was pinned, his face pale, his mouth gasping. "Leave me. I'm good. I'm good." But Solomon didn't leave men behind. He never had. He planted one boot in the dirt, dug his shoulder beneath the twisted metal, and heaved. His ribs screamed, his arms shook, but the hood lifted just enough for Divas to pull free, dragging himself with raw desperation. By the time they regrouped behind what was left of the second vehicle, 4 of them were bleeding, and the enemy was pressing harder. Lim and Horton laid down bursts of fire, their rifles cracking in unison, holding the attackers at bay. The world narrowed to smoke, heat, and survival. For nearly an hour they held that line, outnumbered, outgunned, but not outwilled. Solomon was everywhere, shouting, shooting, pulling men back to their feet. He moved like a man who had already decided he would die here if that's what it took to keep the others alive. When the medevac finally arrived, they were 6 SEALs, battered but breathing, alive because one Marine had refused to yield. There were no speeches that day, no handshakes or promises spoken out loud, but something unspoken had been forged in the sand. Each of those men carried the same truth. If Solomon Dryden ever needed them, anywhere, anytime, they would come. And now, 15 years later, they had. The gym returned in a rush, the squeak of sneakers on polished wood, the murmurs of parents, the guards standing stiff with confusion. Solomon blinked, steady once more, but the memory clung to him like a second skin. He didn't have to look around to know where his brothers stood. He felt them the way soldiers do, like anchors in a storm. Creed hadn't moved. His arms were still folded, his eyes locked on the guards. Meeks was near the back, his gaze scanning like a sentry. Lim stood along the bleachers, calm but alert. Horton leaned casually against the wall, but his stance was coiled, ready. Soto, the one Solomon had pulled to safety years ago, now stood tall, his silence the loudest of them all. And Divas, the man once trapped under twisted steel, was closest, his hands clasped in front of him, his jaw tight, as if daring anyone to try. The guards didn't recognize the weight of what they faced. To them, these were just men in jackets, scattered among parents and grandparents. But the crowd felt it. The air carried it. It was more than protection. It was judgment. Here's the truth. Loyalty is not an accident. It doesn't come from words or titles. It's earned in the places where fear tells you to run, but you stay anyway. Solomon had earned it in the sand, and now that loyalty had walked into a high school gym in Texas to stand against a different kind of enemy. The shorter guard Garvin shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing his belt again, as though clinging to the last symbol of authority he had. Malley chewed harder on his gum, sweat beginning to shine on his forehead. They had started this thinking they were in control. But now, surrounded by silence heavier than any order, they realized they were outnumbered not in bodies, but in spirit. A father in the back row clapped once, deliberately, as if to break the tension. Another parent joined. Soon, a scattering of applause rippled not for the ceremony, but for the man who sat unmoved, flanked by a brotherhood the guards could never touch. Tyrion, waiting in line, felt tears burn the corners of his eyes. He had always respected his father, but this was different. For the first time, he understood the full weight of the stories he had only ever heard in fragments. His father wasn't just a Marine. He was the kind of man others would cross oceans for, the kind of man people rose for, even in silence. And as the names continued to be called on stage, the gym was no longer the same. Each clap for a student carried the echo of the moment unfolding in the third row. Parents didn't just see their children, they saw dignity defended, prejudice exposed, and loyalty living and breathing before their eyes. The flashback faded, but its truth remained. Solomon didn't move. He didn't have to. His silence was an answer. His brothers were the exclamation point. And the guards? They were now the ones being judged. The ceremony was still moving on the surface. Names were being called. Polite claps rose and fell. Students shuffled forward nervously in their gowns. But beneath it all, the gymnasium had shifted into something else entirely. Every eye in the room was being pulled, again and again, toward the third row where Solomon sat, flanked in silence by his brothers. The guards still stood, refusing to back down. The air felt charged, like the heavy pause before a storm finally breaks. Garvin, the shorter guard with the shaved head, was unraveling. He didn't understand what had just happened, why 6 strangers had risen without being asked, why the crowd was turning against him, why his authority wasn't enough. His pride was screaming at him to double down. Pride, after all, is the fuel of prejudice. When faced with dignity that won't bow, pride flares hotter, uglier. He leaned down again, so close that Solomon could feel the man's breath on his cheek. "You think you're special because of that uniform?" Garvin spat, his voice sharp now, no longer bothering to hide the venom. "You think it makes you better than the rest of us? This is a school, not your parade ground." The hush that followed was deeper than silence. It was collective disbelief. The crowd had been waiting for the mask to slip, and now it had fallen all the way off. It wasn't about a seat. It wasn't about order. It was about who Solomon was: a black man, a Marine, a father who refused to move. Mally, the taller guard, shifted uncomfortably. His gum chewing slowed, his eyes darting toward the stage as though looking for someone, anyone, to step in and stop this before it spiraled further. But Garvin wasn't interested in retreat. His hand hovered near his belt again, not on a weapon but close enough to suggest one. It was the posture of intimidation, of a man desperate to remind everyone who he thought had power. Creed stepped forward another inch, his voice like a blade. "If you touch him, you'll answer to me." For the first time, Garvin looked rattled. His eyes flicked to Creed, then back to Solomon. He wasn't used to being challenged, not like this. Not by silence, not by the unspoken strength of 6 men who didn't need to raise their voices to command the room. And then, as if the universe wanted to strip away the last shred of pretense, Garvin snapped. "Men like you," he said loudly enough for rows of parents and students to hear, "always think the rules don't apply, always think you're owed something." The gasp from the crowd was sharp, almost like a physical blow. A mother covered her mouth. A teenager muttered, "Did he really just say that?" Phones tilted higher, recording every second. This wasn't just a local confrontation anymore. This was about to become a story larger than the walls of the gym could hold. Solomon's jaw tightened, but he did not rise. He did not lash out. He stayed rooted, as if the chair had been built for him alone. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "I don't need to think the rules don't apply. I've spent my life defending them." The line landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward. Tyrion, still in line, felt pride surge through him, mingled with a fire that made his hands clench. He wanted to shout, to call out the injustice for what it was. But then he looked at his father still, steady, unbroken, and he understood. This was strength. This was the lesson he was supposed to see. Garvin's face flushed red. His voice rose, brittle with anger. "You don't belong here in the front. You'll move." Or, he didn't finish because Creed's voice cut across him like thunder. "Or what?" The other SEALs didn't speak, but their presence was a wall. Meeks unfolded his arms. Diva shifted a step closer to the aisle. Horton and Lim straightened from their casual poses. Each movement was small, but the effect was enormous. Suddenly, it was Garvin and Mally who looked surrounded, not Solomon. And then the crowd began to change. What had been whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into words spoken aloud. "Let him stay. He has every right. Why are they bothering him?" The authority Garvin thought he had was dissolving in real time, not just because of Solomon's brothers, but because the people were no longer willing to stay silent. The principal, finally breaking from her paralysis, hurried toward the aisle, whispering urgently into her walkie-talkie. She didn't confront the guards directly. Fear was etched too clearly in her face, but she was signaling, calling for someone higher, someone with more authority. But by now, authority didn't rest with the guards or even with the principal. Authority rested with the truth that had just been unveiled, right there in front of everyone. Garvin, cornered by silence, doubled down one last time. He jabbed a finger toward Solomon's chest. "You don't run this place. I do." Before Creed or any of the others could move, Solomon turned his head fully toward Garvin, meeting his eyes. And with a voice calm enough to be terrifying, he said, "Son, you've never run a day in my life." The room broke. Applause, sharp and deliberate, rose from the back row. Then another clap, louder, from the bleachers. Within seconds, the sound swelled into a roar, hundreds of hands clapping, students stomping in their gowns, the gym vibrating with a wave of support. It wasn't polite applause. It was defiance. It was solidarity. The guards froze. For the first time, they understood they had lost. Here's the lesson. Racism always reveals itself when pressed. It starts in whispers, hides behind rules, dresses itself in authority. But press it hard enough, and it will speak its true name out loud. And when it does, it loses. Because dignity, when defended with silence and steadiness, will always expose the weakness of hate. The clapping didn't stop. Even as the next name was called on stage, the rhythm of resistance drowned out the ceremony itself. Tyrion's classmates looked around in awe, some whispering, "That's his dad." Phones streamed the moment live, comments flooding in, "This is history. Justice in real time. Stand with Solomon." And while the guards hesitated, uncertain and humiliated, the truth had already won. The boiling point had been reached. From the lineup near the stage, Tyron Dryden's heart was hammering so hard he thought the students beside him could hear it. He clutched the edge of his graduation program, his palms damp, his eyes fixed on the third row where his father sat. For weeks he had imagined this day. The walk across the stage, the grin for the camera, the handshake with the principal, the hug with his dad afterward. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him to watch his father become the center of a storm. He had seen the two guards approach, their shoulders squared, their tone sharp. He had seen the way his father refused to move, the calm that never cracked even as their words turned uglier. And then he had seen the men, those 6 strangers, rising from the crowd, one by one, like pieces of a hidden truth finally stepping into the light. His classmates were whispering, some even snickering nervously. But Tyron wasn't laughing. He was burning. Pride, anger, confusion, they all collided inside him like sparks. The girl in line ahead of him nudged him gently. "Is that your dad?" she whispered, her voice carrying both awe and disbelief. Tyron swallowed hard. "Yeah." She shook her head slowly. "Man, he's not even moving. He doesn't have to." Her words cut through him. He knew exactly what she meant. His dad didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to stand, didn't need to fight back the way most people expected. He was fighting in a different way by refusing to give an inch, by showing that dignity could sit still while arrogance flailed all around it. Tyron thought back to when he was 12, the day he came home in tears because a boy at school had mocked his name. "Dryden," the boy had said. "Sounds like you're dry and dead." It was silly, childish, but it had stung. He'd told his father he wanted to change his name, shorten it, make it less noticeable. His dad had sat down beside him, his voice low and steady. "Son, our name carries weight. It's not about what they say. It's about what you carry when you wear it. One day you'll understand." Now he understood. The weight of his name was not just history, it was responsibility. The ceremony carried on, names being called, hands shaking, cameras flashing, but Tyron's world had shrunk to the third row and the aisle where those guards stood frozen. He watched as the applause for other students turned louder, not for the graduates themselves, but as a subtle act of defiance. Parents who hadn't clapped before were clapping now, as if each name was a reminder that Solomon still sat where he belonged. "Dryden," he heard someone whisper behind him in line. "That's the Marines kid." The label landed on him differently than he expected. It wasn't a burden, it was a crown. At last, the assistant principal motioned for his row to move forward. Tyron's breath quickened. He wiped his palms on his gown, trying to steady himself. Each step felt heavier, not from nerves about tripping on the stage or forgetting to shake with his right hand, but from the knowledge that hundreds of eyes were watching not just him, but his father through him. The students ahead of him filed onto the stage. One girl waved at her parents, nearly losing her cap. A boy's honor cords slipped off his shoulders, and he laughed nervously as he fixed them. Life carried on, as if nothing extraordinary were happening just feet away. But Tyron knew better. Finally, his name was called. The announcer's voice was slower, steadier than before, almost reverent. Tyron Dryden. For a split second, the world froze. Then the room erupted. The applause that followed wasn't just the usual cheer for a graduating student, it was a wave. Loud, deliberate, unified. The 6 men who had risen for Solomon now clapped in perfect rhythm, their hands striking together like a drumbeat of solidarity. Parents stood, some whistling, some crying, without even knowing why. Students in line stomped their feet. The noise was deafening, but beneath it all, Tyron heard the message, "We see you. We see your father. We honor both." He walked across the stage slowly, chin lifted, steps measured. His heart pounded, but it wasn't nerves anymore. It was pride, the kind that came from carrying more than your own weight. He took the diploma from the principal, her hand trembling slightly as she shook his. Then he turned toward the audience, and there he was. His father, still seated, still steady, eyes locked on him. Solomon didn't clap, didn't rise, didn't wave. He simply smiled, the smallest, most meaningful smile Tyron had ever seen. It was enough. Their eyes met, and in that look, everything passed between them. "You did it. I'm proud. Carry the name well." Tyron nodded once, a gesture small but heavy, before stepping off the stage. The applause followed him all the way back to his seat, echoing like a tide that refused to recede. As he sat, diploma in hand, his chest felt tight, not with nerves but with realization. He understood now that manhood wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the strongest fist in a fight. It was about holding your ground when the world tries to move you. It was about letting dignity speak louder than anger. It was about carrying your name like a banner, even when others tried to tear it down. The guards were still there, their faces red, their bodies stiff, but their power was gone, stripped away by silence, loyalty, and the weight of truth. Tyrion knew this wasn't over. There would be fallout, questions, maybe even headlines, but in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was that he had walked his stage, his father had held his ground, and together they had shown the world what strength really looked like. Here's the lesson. Children don't just inherit their parents' names, they inherit their battles, their dignity, and their legacy. And when they witness those battles fought with honor, they learn how to carry that legacy forward. Tyrion sat taller in his seat, diploma resting on his lap, and for the first time in his life, he didn't just feel like a son, he felt like an heir. When the final name was read, when the last cap flew into the air and rained back down in a shower of black fabric and youthful shouts, the official part of the ceremony ended. But no one in the Elm Ridge High Gymnasium left the same way they came in. Something had shifted. It was in the way people whispered as they filed toward the exits, in the way students kept sneaking glances at the third row, in the way phones stayed lifted long after the music faded. The two guards had slunk back toward the corner of the gym, no longer prowling, no longer trying to project control. They leaned against the wall, speaking into their radios in short bursts, their faces tight with the embarrassment of men who had lost before an entire town. The principal avoided eye contact with them, choosing instead to busy herself with congratulating students and shaking hands, her smile too stiff to look genuine. She knew what the cameras had caught. She knew what the community had seen. And the community was not silent anymore. Near the bleachers, a group of parents gathered, shaking their heads in disbelief. One mother's voice rose above the rest. "I don't care what anyone says. That man had every right to sit where he was. Every right." Her words were answered by nods, murmurs of agreement, even applause from those still lingering nearby. Others looked less sure, shifting uncomfortably, muttering about rules and policies. But for the first time, the debate wasn't happening in whispers. It was happening out loud, in the open. Students were quicker still. Phones buzzed in their hands, thumbs flying across screens as clips of the confrontation went live. Videos showed Solomon sitting firm while the guards loomed over him. They showed Creed stepping into the aisle, his voice calm but sharp. "You don't." They showed 6 men rising in silent unison, their postures alone commanding more respect than any badge or radio. By the time Tyrion hugged his friends in the backlot, hashtags were already appearing online. Number Stand with Solomon, number Front Row Belongs, number Silent Strength. The kids didn't frame it as a local spat. They framed it as part of something larger, and in many ways, they were right. Outside, in the parking lot, clusters of families celebrated, posing for photos, draping honor cords around proud shoulders. But even there, the conversation kept returning to what had unfolded inside. "Did you see how he just sat there?" one father said, his voice half awed, half shaken. "Didn't raise his voice, didn't move an inch," another parent added. "And those men? The way they stood? I've never seen anything like it." Tyrion heard these words as he hugged classmates and posed for pictures. His diploma folder felt heavier in his hands, not because of the paper inside, but because of what it represented now. He wasn't just the kid who graduated. He was the son of the man who had turned a graduation ceremony into a lesson about dignity, loyalty, and truth. He could feel eyes on him, even as laughter and camera flashes surrounded him. His friends clapped him on the back, one saying, "Your dad's a legend, bro. Straight up." Tyrion smiled, but deep inside he felt the weight of those words. A legend was a legacy, and a legacy was something you had to carry. Solomon stepped out into the sunlight minutes later, his posture the same as it had been in the gym, upright, firm, but calm. Creed was near him, along with the others. They didn't huddle close, didn't crowd him, but their presence was still unmistakable. They were watchful, steady, making sure the weight of the moment didn't crush the dignity of the man they stood for. A small group of parents approached. One, a woman with silver hair and a trembling voice, reached out a hand. "Mr. Dryden, I just want to say thank you. My grandson is graduating today, and he's going to remember this more than any speech." Solomon nodded once, his voice quiet. It was his day, ma'am. That's all I wanted. But everyone knew it had become more than that. By the time families began to pull out of the parking lot, social media had already carried the story beyond Elmridge. Clips spread across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Some were 15 seconds long, focusing on Garvin's ugly words. Men like you always think you're owed something. Others showed the 6 men rising, their silence radiating through the grainy phone footage like thunder in slow motion. One clip, shaky but powerful, captured Solomon's calm reply. I don't need to think the rules don't apply. I've spent my life defending them. The comments poured in. This man deserves respect. You can't watch this and not feel the power. This is what dignity looks like. Not everyone agreed, of course. Some argued in threads that rules are rules and he should have just moved. But the tide of voices drowned them out, pointing to the obvious truth. Rules weren't the issue. Prejudice was. And in Elmridge itself, the shift was tangible. For years, whispers of bias had floated around the way black students were disciplined more harshly, the way certain parents always seemed to get the front row seats, the way rules bent for some and not for others. But never had it been so stark, so undeniable, so public. Here's the lesson. Communities rarely awaken in silence. It takes a spark, a moment so clear and undeniable that it forces people to choose, to look away or to look closer, to excuse or to confront, to stay silent or to finally speak. For Elmridge, the spark had been a Marine sitting in a plastic chair while 6 silent brothers rose around him. That night, local news ran the story. Confrontation at graduation, the headline read. Interviews with parents played over shaky footage, their voices firm. It wasn't about rules, it was about respect. The camera lingered on Solomon's face, calm even in silence. He hadn't given any speeches, he hadn't demanded the microphone, but his stillness had spoken volumes. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Tyron sat at his kitchen table, diploma on the counter, phone buzzing with messages from classmates and strangers alike. His father sat across from him, eating in silence, as though the day had been ordinary, but Tyron knew it hadn't been. He knew the world outside their door was beginning to stir, beginning to pay attention. For the first time, he understood what it meant to inherit not just a name, but a calling. The house was quieter than the gym had ever been. No folding chairs scraping, no thunder of applause, no guards trying to flex their authority. Just the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint chirp of crickets outside the window. Tyron sat at the kitchen table still in his graduation gown, half-zipped diploma folder resting against his elbow. His phone buzzed every few seconds with new notifications, classmates tagging him, strangers commenting on videos, hashtags multiplying by the minute, but he had turned the screen face down. Tonight wasn't about the world outside. Tonight was about the man sitting across from him. Solomon had changed out of his uniform, now wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans. The medals and the polished boots were gone, but the weight of his presence hadn't shifted. He sat with a plate of food in front of him, eating slowly, calmly, as if this had been any other day. For Solomon, the uniform was never the source of his dignity. It was simply the outer shell. The core, the stillness, the integrity, the unshakable resolve that was always there. Tyron stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. Dad, why didn't you say anything? When they came for you, when everyone was watching, why didn't you stand up or fight back? Solomon looked at his son, chewing once more before setting his fork down. His voice was steady, warm, but edged with the gravity of a man who had carried this lesson for a lifetime. Because I didn't need to. I don't have to stand up for who I am, and I don't need to raise my voice to be heard. Tyron frowned, leaning forward. But they disrespected you. Everyone saw it. Shouldn't you have? They saw more than disrespect, Solomon interrupted gently. They saw the truth. They saw 2 men try to move me out of a seat I had every right to, and they saw me refuse to budge. They saw 6 men stand because of the kind of life I've lived. They saw dignity hold its ground, and that will last longer than any argument. Tyron sat back, chewing on the words. He thought about the guards' sneers, about the way his father had remained rooted even as they leaned inches from his face. He thought about the silence, how it had grown heavier than the guards' voices until the entire gym seemed to lean toward it. He thought about the eruption of applause when his name was called. Silence cuts deeper than shouting. Solomon continued, his tone calm but firm. Anger can burn hot, but it burns out quick. Dignity? Dignity sticks. It lingers in people's minds. They'll replay today in their heads, son. They'll remember the guard's words, and they'll remember the silence that answered louder. Tyrion lowered his eyes, nodding slowly. It's just, I wanted to walk off the stage. When I saw what they were doing to you, I was 2 seconds from making a scene. Solomon leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. And that's why you didn't, because you trusted me to handle it, and because you knew that walking that stage was your moment. If you had let them take it from you, if you had let anger rob you of that walk, then they would have won twice. They didn't deserve that power. You kept it. You walked proud. That's how you fight back. The words hit Tyrion deeper than he expected. He thought back to the look his father had given him from the third row, a smile, small but full of meaning. He realized now that it hadn't been just pride. It had been permission. Go. Take your moment. I've got mine handled. There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, that gave room for the truth to settle. Finally, Tyrion broke it. Who were they? Those men who stood for you? Solomon's eyes softened, a rare flicker of nostalgia crossing his face. He leaned back in his chair, hands resting loosely on his knees. They're men I bled with, men I dragged through sand and fire, men who dragged me too when I couldn't stand on my own. You don't forget people like that, and they don't forget you. We made a promise in a place where promises meant life or death. If I needed them, they'd show up, and they did. Tyrion let out a low whistle, shaking his head. So all those stories you never told me, they were real. Solomon chuckled quietly. All too real. One day, maybe I'll tell you the full versions. You're old enough now to handle the hard parts. Tyrion looked at his father with new eyes. He had always admired him, always respected him. But tonight, he understood something deeper. His father's strength wasn't in the medals or the stories or even the silence in the gym. It was in the way he carried himself every single day, the way he refused to let anyone take away his dignity, the way he honored promises to his wife, his brothers, and now his son. Solomon reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the small, worn photograph he had carried all day. His wife's smile, Tyrion as a baby in her arms. He laid it on the table between them. I carried this through Kandahar. I carried it when I lost your mom, and I carried it today, not because it gives me strength, but because it reminds me of what's worth protecting. That's you, son. That's our name. That's why I didn't move. Tyrion blinked hard, swallowing the lump in his throat. He picked up the photograph gently, his fingers brushing over the faded edges. I want to be like that, he whispered. Like you. Solomon smiled softly, shaking his head. You already are. You walked that stage with pride. You didn't let anger steal your moment. You stayed grounded, even when everything around you tried to shake you. That's what being a Dryden means. That's what carrying our name means. The two of them sat in silence again, the photo resting on the table, the weight of the day settling between them. Outside, the town was buzzing, phones lighting up with videos and debates, hashtags and outrage. But inside this kitchen, there was only a father and a son, a lesson passed down not in lectures but in lived example. Here's the lesson. Legacy is not just about what you achieve, it's about what you pass on. Children don't inherit words, they inherit witness. And tonight, Tyrion had witnessed what it meant to hold dignity in the face of injustice. He would carry it for the rest of his life. Solomon finally rose, stretching his back, his movements slow with the weight of age and battles fought. Come on, he said, his voice lighter now. It's been a long day. Tomorrow we'll see what the world has to say. Tonight, it's just us. Tyrion stood too, diploma folder in one hand, the photograph in the other. For the first time, he didn't feel like just a son looking up at his father. He felt like a man standing beside one. The morning sun spilled across Elm Ridge, painting the red brick buildings gold. Normally, the day after graduation was quiet, a few families lingering in town for brunch, balloons deflating in the back seats of cars, students still buzzing with the thrill of being done. But this morning was different. The story of what had unfolded inside the gym had already slipped out of the town's borders. It had spilled into phones, into living rooms, into headlines. Local news anchors spoke over shaky cell phone clips. A Marine father confronted at his son's graduation until 6 former Navy SEALs stood by his side. Regional networks replayed Garvin's words, cutting them against the roar of applause that followed Solomon's calm reply. Social media threads buzzed with hashtags, number silent strength, number stand with Solomon, number front row belongs. The world had turned its gaze toward a small Texas town and toward a father who had simply refused to move. Solomon knew it before he even stepped outside that morning. His phone, which he rarely paid attention to, was full of messages. Old friends from the Corps, former neighbors, even fellow Marines he hadn't spoken to in years. One text read, "You didn't have to say a word, brother. We saw everything." Another said, "The world just got a glimpse of the man we've known all along." But inside his home, none of that seemed to matter. The breakfast table was set the same as always, 2 plates, one for him and one for Tyrion, though the young graduate was still asleep upstairs. The photograph of his wife still rested on the shelf by the window. Solomon poured himself coffee, black, no sugar, and sat in the silence he preferred. The noise outside, the opinions and arguments, would come whether he invited them or not. But the dignity he carried, that was his to keep. Later that day, when Tyrion finally came downstairs, still in sweatpants, hair sticking up in a dozen directions, he rubbed his eyes and mumbled, "Dad, I think the whole internet knows about us." He slid his phone across the table. Headlines scrolled, "Marine humiliated at graduation fights back with silence. 6 veterans rise for 1 man. A father's dignity teaches a community." Tyrion looked at his father, half expecting pride, maybe even excitement, but Solomon only took a sip of his coffee. "The internet doesn't know me," he said softly. "You do. That's what matters." Still, he could see what this meant to his son. Tyrion wasn't just a graduate anymore, he was the witness to something larger than a ceremony. He was the carrier of the legacy. That afternoon, Solomon agreed to drive him into town. The Charger's engine rumbled steady, the same way it always had. But everywhere they stopped, people recognized them. At the diner, the waitress whispered, "Thank you for yesterday." At the gas station, a man in a ball cap nodded silently, eyes full of respect. Even those who said nothing seemed to move differently around them, less dismissive, more careful, as though they'd been forced to reckon with something they couldn't ignore. Tyrion noticed it all. "They're looking at you differently," he said quietly. Solomon shook his head. "They're not looking at me, they're looking at themselves. They're asking what they would have done. That's what moments like this do they hold up a mirror." And he was right. In living rooms across Elm Ridge, families were replaying the videos, asking each other the same questions. Would I have spoken up? Would I have clapped louder? Would I have stood? The conversation was no longer about one man's seat in a gym. It was about who belonged, who got pushed to the back, and who had the courage to resist. That evening, when the house was quiet again, Tyrion sat across from his father, diploma folder still on the table between them. He tapped it once, hesitating before speaking. "Dad, yesterday, it felt like more than graduation. It felt like, I don't know, like history." Solomon nodded. "That's because it was. Not the kind you read about in books. The kind that happens when ordinary people decide not to move. History doesn't always come with speeches and headlines. Sometimes it comes with silence." Tyrion leaned back, letting the words sink in. He thought about how he'd nearly walked off the stage, how close he'd come to letting anger steal his moment. But his father's calm had anchored him. That lesson would stay with him long after the diplomas gathered dust. And here is the final lesson. Strength is not measured by how loud you can shout or how fast you can fight. True strength is measured by how steady you remain when the world tries to move you. Silence, when rooted in dignity, is not weakness, it's power. Power that exposes injustice. Power that inspires loyalty. Power that awakens communities. By the end of the week, the story of Solomon Dryden would be shared far beyond Texas. It would inspire op-eds, podcasts, debates in classrooms, and sermons in churches. But for Solomon, it was never about that. It was about keeping his promise to his wife, about watching his son walk that stage, about passing on a legacy worth carrying. On Sunday morning, as he and Tyrion walked out to the Charger, the town still buzzing with chatter, Solomon placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember this, son. Life will give you 100 chances to lose yourself to anger. And sometimes anger feels right, but most of the time, silence will cut deeper. Dignity will last longer. Carry our name with that truth." Tyrion nodded, his chest tight with both pride and responsibility. "I will, Dad." Um, as they pulled out of the driveway, the evening sun stretched long shadows across the road, the same way it had when Solomon first drove into Elmridge the day before. Only now, the shadows carried something else, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice, even in the quiet battles fought in ordinary places, justice always finds its way. Because real men don't vanish when things get uncomfortable. They show up, they stand, and sometimes they sit still silent, unmovable, unforgettable. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear what true strength looks like. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of justice, dignity, and resilience. And in the comments, tell us, what does strength mean to you?